Hopefully that was worth the wait, because maybe the visuals will help in this case. I'm always thinking if it's worthwhile or not. I was very impressed by the first talk and its scope, and I'm going to limit the scope to a certain part of Europe, and maybe just take contention with one point which I agree with and yet would like to take contention, and that is with the success story regarding Central and Eastern Europe. Okay. Before we celebrate success, let us look at some of the flaws which are in there, but of course in the general picture, we can always pick a general picture. In preparing for this talk today, I found myself reaching out on my bookshelf for a book which I didn't particularly like. It came out recently, but for some reason I felt that I need to flip through it again. And that is Frank Furedi, English sociologist, came out with a book this year, First World War, Still No End in Sight. Now, I like the title of that book specifically, mainly because I'm teaching a course on World War I now, and of course I had to read through all the huge literature that came out this year, like Christopher Clark that you mentioned, and a few others, very big tomes on the reasons for World War I. Huge books came out, a whole library of books, and more books are going to follow. And yet, Furedi says that actually we should be looking at not what builds up to World War I, but when does World War I end, not when does it begin. His answer is it doesn't end, we're still living World War I. A thesis which I think we can all agree with at some point or other. It fits into your talk fine, I find myself agreeing with it. I don't quite like the way he explains it. I don't think it actually, but his point is that the whole history of the 20th century is reworking the issues of World War I, therefore World War II and the Cold War all relate to World War I, which is maybe all right. However, what I find interesting in this book is something else, quite tangential. That relates to the name of the author, Furedi. Because Furedi, English sociologist, is interesting. Not the typical English name, is it? Born in Hungary and arrives in England as a young child in 1956. And therefore I thought this would be quite interesting for that reason to read the book. But the only mention of Hungary in the whole book is a couple of references in a word. And in the introduction where he says his grandfather, who served in World War I and died in World War II, would have appreciated this book, but doesn't explain anything beyond that. And there's a huge Freudian slip. He doesn't mention Hungary at all. Maybe the one country which actually is still living the World War I more than any other country in Europe. And I'll try and explain why. And so my focus, under the assumption that often when we look at these issues, we look at it from a Western point of view. And even if we look at the whole of Europe around the scale, we miss certain issues. I thought maybe we'd Central Europe. I look at the long World War I of Central Europe and its consequences, and how that plays itself through the other two stages that we're marking today, World War II and the fall of the wall. And with that, I'll refer first of all to an event that happened quite recently. June 2014, the world is marking, I wouldn't say celebrating, marking the centenary of the assassination in Sarajevo. And what's happening at the same time in Hungary and Budapest? Quite interesting. The unveiling of a statue. Hungarians like to unveil statues like many countries, but a statue to whom it's interesting? To István Tisza, the Prime Minister of Hungary in 1914. And this is quite interesting, because historians all make a mistake. Clark, and everybody in fact makes a mistake when we talk about the assassination of 1914 and the July crisis, because we refer to the blank check. Now we've heard there's three blank checks, of course, but the blank check with a capital T is the blank check given by Austria. Austria doesn't give a blank check, there is no Austria. It's the dual monarchy, of course, the K und K, who gives a blank check. It needs two partners. The whole system is organized in a constitutional way. In order to give the blank check, they have to convince their junior partner. We talked about senior partners, junior partners, the junior partner. Therefore, Austria, which is keen on presenting an ultimatum to Serbia, needs to get the support of Hungary. The Prime Minister of Hungary, István Tisza, doesn't want to give his support for the war, because actually the Balkans don't interest him that much. He doesn't see, at the time at least, he didn't see at the time, June 1914, he didn't see the South Slavs as a major problem. However, he was convinced, because he realized that the crisis could lead to another problem. It could lead to an alliance with Romania, which would make the Romanians make claims on Transylvania. And that convinced him. Then he became an adamant supporter of the war and supported it throughout the war. Since then, he's an incredibly problematic person. In fact, this statue which has been unveiled, this massive statue in Kossuth Square in front of the Hungarian parliament, is a reconstruction or a rebuilding of a statue that used to exist in the interwar period. Here's the original statue, 1934 to 1945, smashed in 1945, was damage caused during the war, but intentionally left to be smashed, because it was seen as a problematic statue for a warmonger, for a supporter of World War I. The man wouldn't let Hungary leave the war when there were different opportunities. But it's interesting, now it's being rebuilt, and hailed, in fact, by the Hungarian premier, who's an interesting character in himself. If we look at European unity, well, I'll refer to him as well. But it's interesting, because this happened in June, on the tail of another anniversary, also celebrated in Budapest and throughout Hungary. And that's the anniversary to mark the end of World War I, or as it's seen in Hungary on another scale. Hungary introduced, a few years ago, a National Unity Day to mark June 2014. And what do they mark? To mark June 1920. Why in Hungary do they mark the 4th of June 1920 of all dates? That's the most meaningful date. Not 1914, not 1945, not 1989. Why is that such an important date? And why is there a national ceremony here and ceremonies held throughout Hungary and beyond? Because they're actually marking the peace treaty at the end of World War I, the famous Trianon Treaty. So here we reach 3 stages. I'm going to walk us through 3 stages. End of World War I, end of World War II, and the fall of communism, the war. 3 stages. And I look at the end, not at the beginning, in fact. I think endings are quite interesting in this sense. 1920, often we talk about the consequences of Versailles, but for any Hungarian, maybe for most people in Central Europe, the big event is not the Versailles Peace Treaty, but the Trianon Peace Treaty. The breaking up of this famous Count Cut, the dual monarchy, and the severing of the historical kingdom of Hungary as they see it. Now this is seen as a traumatic event. This is seen as the ultimate humiliation. Much has been written about the economic and other consequences of Versailles and how it lays the path for future conflicts in many ways. But for Hungarians, the focus is exactly on the smaller palace, the Palace of Trianon, near the Palace of Versailles. And here this is seen as a diktat. The big peace diktat in which Hungary has to sign a treaty which is against all their claims. They have to give away territorial land, an issue which is very strong, I think, also to speak about in Israel, giving away of the land of the heritage, the land of the homelands that had to be given away. And the reception for that, of course, seceded to the other successor states, to Slovakia, to Slovenia, to other countries, onto Italy, and that is given away, and countries around. And of course, Romania, which receives larger land than is left in Hungary itself, Transylvania. If we look how that's received throughout Hungary, this is seen as a traumatic event. Trauma is constructed at the moment. Of course, collective trauma is always constructed. Trauma is constructed spontaneously at the moment throughout Hungary. We see the notices, the news notices of this peace conference are published in the newspaper in black as if it was a death notice. It's quite interesting to see newspapers from 1920 circled with a black frame because it's a traumatic event. Hungary is being dismembered forcefully as they see it. Protests being held in Hungarian towns throughout Hungary. Here people are going to the National Museum to lay wreaths and mourn about the dismemberment of Hungary. And this, of course, leads itself into a culture of irredentism. Hungary, already in 1921, sets up a series of monuments in the center of Budapest, in Szabadság tér, the Liberty Square, monuments to the lost regions, to the 4 lost regions, the north, the south, the east, the west, the lost Hungarian lands which are being reclaimed. Again, we're talking about satisfying claims for lost lands, which happened before, to be followed with this hill built in the middle of the square where land is brought from all the lost regions of Hungary and buried in the center to mark this loss, and monuments to the great grief, which develops in a whole culture of commemoration of the well of Hungarian justice, dedicated to none other than Lord Rothermere. Why does Lord Rothermere get a monument in Budapest? Because he writes a series of articles, Justice for Hungary. Therefore they find somebody who can propagate their cause in the English-speaking world. And the statue of Hungarian grief, which afterwards was lost. People, it was actually an abstract monument. It turned afterwards into the statue of a swimmer during the communist period. But that's a different point. But this kind of huge culture of irredentism, which is not only marked with these big statues and big national ceremonies of mourning, but a huge culture of material culture of posters. Thousands of posters are printed in the interwar period to mark. One of my favorites is this poster here, because it's the first marking I see of salami politics avant la lettre. This is salami politics before Rákosi coins the phrase after World War II. This is salami politics, this dismembering of historical Hungary as it's seen. The Hungarian here is nem nem soha, no, no, never. This is the soldiers from the successor states coming around and ripping off pieces of the historical Hungary. Hungary is the crucified, martyred nation. These images are what political scientists would call banal nationalism. I think all nationalism is banal, but that's a different point. Banal nationalism is the small memorabilia in which people remember the lost territories and were taught to think about the Greater Hungary. This is in the Trianon Museum in a town called Varla Palota, in the center of Hungary, near the Balaton Lake, where anybody who comes from the Hungarian diaspora can go in free because it welcomes the Greater Hungary. It's a museum for the Greater Hungary, of the small Hungary of today. And there you can see case upon case of matchboxes, pencil cases, notebooks. Students would go, people would play board games. Instead of Monopoly, you would play board games of traveling around the historical Hungary so you'll know where's your homeland, what doesn't belong to you. And of course, the charts upon charts that mark what was lost. Losing, as it was seen, of the Greater Hungary, losing 2/3 of the territory, losing a third of the population, losing a port to the sea, losing agriculture, losing industry, losing finances, the great loss and destroying what's seen as a great trauma, which they can't see the world identifying with. The world was actually seeing other sides, other perspectives to the same point. Self-determination, of course, these are the two sides which we heard about so wonderfully in the first presentation. But this feeds itself into a culture of embitterment, the word that I used before, resentfulness. And this resentfulness, of course, leads you into strange bedfellows of those who will justify it. Whereas the Western world wouldn't justify it. Of course, they found those who would. What's the Western world? West and East are interesting terms in this sense. But of course, it is exactly the forces of fascism which will justify this revanchism and this irredentism. Mussolini, interesting enough, was one of the great supporters from the beginning. He was willing to recognize Hungarian territorial claims, except those, of course, from Italy. Those had to be forgotten. We're not talking about the Rijeka Fiume. But, of course, this reaches practical results in the Vienna Awards, the first and second Vienna Awards, in which partners came together to solve this issue. But Hungary is privileged and got territorial grants. Here, of course, is the Admiral Horthy himself riding his white horse, reclaiming national lands. And this leads us into the Hungarian involvement, of course, into World War II. So moving into the second stage, what happens after World War II? This is kind of the reclaim and the redemption, as it's seen of this embitterment caused by World War I. Post-World War II, and here we have the Paris peace treaties at the end of World War II, and this is the Hungarian peace treaty. Of course, all this dream exploded, it was lost completely. Hungary still thought afterwards that it convinced the different powers of its right to get these territorial claims. It went to Moscow and received certain promises, it went to America, went to London, but of course nothing actually happened. Everything was taken away, even with the correction that some more had to be given to Czechoslovakia. So in fact it came out on the losing side, which only increased bitterness. However, this couldn't be expressed as in the interwar period. Because in the post-World War time, of course, Hungary is set up as the Soviet, or the Republic, the People's Republic of Hungary. And during this period, irredentism is banned as public discourse. It's taboo. This cannot be mentioned at all. It's taught in the classrooms as a lesson of, Trianon as a lesson of wrong thinking according to the Marxist-Leninist analysis. This is an imperial debate, this debate over borders. And there's an interest invested behind this, of course. The Soviet Union wants to form the Eastern Bloc. And therefore it can't allow these tensions in the Eastern Bloc of one country demanding territorial claims from other countries. So therefore this cannot be talked about. And this would seem to cover the whole Soviet period or the whole communist period, but I would take that actually with a grain of salt. I think if we look under the current, it's always very hard to see what's happening in the background of our socialist politics, but it's quite interesting because I think there's a difference. 1956 I think actually marks a difference. Under the first regime, under Matyas Rákosi, the more Stalinist rule, authoritarian rule of Hungarian socialism, it is indeed forbidden to talk in any way about territorial claims. But after 1956, under János Kadar, there's an attempt to try and win the hearts and minds of the population, to show that they're not foreign, that they actually identify with the claims. And therefore we can see, entering into politics of Komintern and other forums, how Hungarian claims for the rights of Hungarian minorities in the Eastern Bloc, maybe certain concessions given to Hungary, that becomes part of a debate which is entertained, even if it doesn't end up into anything practical. And this leads us to the third station, which I'd like to visit, post-communism. To remember the anniversary we're speaking about now, of course, has its own dissidence. The anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall is, of course, chained. There's a trigger. It's triggered by a chain of events which actually can be traced, if we wish, to Central Europe. Exactly to opening the border, for example, between Austria and Hungary, the flight of East Germans into Hungary not wanting to return. The famous picnic which is held on the border, the picnic of Europe. All these events which seem to kind of cause pressure and also to encourage the great festival which turns into the fall and breaking down of the Berlin Wall. And then, of course, the great gathering in Budapest and the declaration of a second republic. What happens here? Suddenly things begin to creep out of the cupboard, things that hadn't been talked about for all this period. This resentment returns. And it returns in a soft way. If we look at the first post-communist government in Hungary, that of József Antal, we hear it make of interesting claims. Very interesting government for many reasons, but one of them is that it had a huge number of historians in the government. We don't see that today that much anymore. But of course the prime minister was an historian, József Antal. His foreign minister was an historian who specialized in Trianon, Wierzynski. It's quite interesting. And a team of other historians sitting in government, and they began making interesting claims. Antal writes a speech in which he says that he is a prime minister of 15 million Hungarians. But there aren't 15 million Hungarians in Hungary. So he was asked, what does this mean? So he qualified by saying, in spirit. So he's a prime minister in spirit of the greater Hungary, but not practically. But then we see, for example, a TV channel of Duna being which is a TV channel of the greater Hungary, which has irredentist weather. You can see in Hungary the weather goes all over the greatest Hungary. It doesn't just stop in Hungary. I always like to see how, especially in England, in Ireland, it's always interesting, where the BBC stops, where the clouds stop on the Northern Irish border. Always quite interesting. But in this case, then we look at European expansion. What does that mean? So with European expansion, 2004, Hungary joins the EU together with the Czech Republic, with Slovakia and Slovenia. 2007, Romania. 2013, Croatia. So with this expansion, again, you can't talk about irredentism because it will break up the package. Again, you have to have an imposed silence. But actually, no, this doesn't put quiet on it. And it's quite interesting because exactly in 2010, the right-wing government of Viktor Orban announces a National Unity Day. A National Unity Day, which is described by the Budapest Times as a Trianon name in all but name. It's a Trianon Day in which you mark Trianon as a trauma. And throughout Hungary, monuments are set up. Every town in Hungary now, I've traveled around Hungary extensively to document this, every village and every town now has a Trianon monument marking the lost Hungary. So there's this kind of boom of grassroots irredentism, which has its implications in protests happening in different places, in markets, again, of this banal nationalism of these different markers, of car stickers. Almost every car in Hungary now has a sticker with the map of the greater Hungary, which includes, so you can go for a holiday, for example, a ski holiday in Slovakia, but you don't see you can cross the border, there's no border or in a border-free Europe, but you have a sticker which seems that you claim this territory. Or you cross a border and you'd go to the sea in Croatia, but your sticker on your car kind of claims that it's Hungarian lands, which is quite bizarre. To kind of wind that up with an anecdote of where the state is now. 2012, I'm walking around Budapest and documenting or marking these different demonstrations, and I'd made the big mistake of going to the National Museum. I said, there must be an interesting event in the National Museum. Actually, there isn't, because it's closed in public holidays. But something interesting happens. I see from outside something which is worth going in anyway. A bit hard to see it in the dark. I'll try and mark it. The flags. Every institution in Budapest, like in any other city in Europe, has to have in the European Union a European flag and a Hungarian flag. But somebody climbed up the pole in the middle of the night and quite nicely added this symbolism for me. Tied the flags into crosses. Once again, we have the martyred nation. And who's to blame this time for the martyred nation? The EU. Not allowing Hungarian territorial claims, which of course leads us, first of all, the fact that Hungary has now offered citizenship to all the countries in the Union, so they all have Hungarian citizenship now, which is quite interesting, to all the Hungarians in all the countries in the Union, which leads us back to this monument, how in many ways in Hungary they're still unveiling, and all over Central Europe they're still unveiling the memories of World War I, which lead into the tight politics of now, which are not all full of reconciliation, not putting an end. We're not at the happy end of the 20th century at all. In fact, in many ways, the signs are still there, the problems are still being worked out, and might lead to additional conflict.